They told her the Americans would cut off her hand. In the spring of 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed into rubble and ash, a young German woman named Helga Weiss sat in a crowded prisoner transport, cradling her wounded hand against her chest. The injury was bad. Everyone could see that. Her fingers had been crushed 3 days earlier when a supply truck overturned during the chaos of retreat. The flesh was turning black. The smell of infection had already begun to spread. The other prisoners looked away when they saw it, their faces tight with the knowledge of what such wounds meant. "When the Americans see this," an older woman whispered to her, "they will not waste medicine on a German. They will take out a saw and remove it. That is what they do to prisoners." Helga was 23 years old. She had been a telegraph operator for the Wehrmacht, one of thousands of young women who served in auxiliary roles while Germany burned around them. Now she was a prisoner, wounded and terrified, heading toward an enemy she had been taught to fear more than death itself. The propaganda had been clear. Americans were savages who showed no mercy. They tortured prisoners. They let the wounded die slowly. They enjoyed cruelty. But 4 hours after arriving at an American field hospital, Helga would be lying on an operating table, tears streaming down her face, watching an enemy surgeon work with steady hands to save every single one of her fingers. The American doctor would not speak German, and she would not speak English, but what happened in that room would change everything she believed about the world. This is the story of that day. It is a story about war and wounds, about fear and unexpected kindness. It is a story that reminds us that even in the darkest times, humanity can appear in the most unlikely places. If you find stories like this meaningful, make sure to like and subscribe to this channel. We bring you true accounts from history that deserve to be remembered. Now let us go back to those final days of the war, when one young woman's life hung in the balance. It's hard to be. The truck that carried Helga and 30 other German prisoners rolled to a stop on a muddy road somewhere in western Germany. It was April 1945, and the countryside was scarred with the marks of war. Bombed-out farmhouses stood like broken teeth against the gray sky. Shell craters pocked the fields where crops should have been growing. The smell of smoke and decay hung in the air, mixing with the sharp scent of diesel from the American vehicles that now controlled these roads. Helga pressed herself against the wooden slats of the truck, trying to make herself small. Her hand throbbed with every heartbeat, a deep, sickening pain that had become her entire world over the past 3 days. She had wrapped it in a piece of torn cloth, but the fabric was now stained dark with blood and something worse. She did not want to look at it. She did not want to think about what lay beneath the makeshift bandage. Around her, the other prisoners sat in exhausted silence. Most were women like herself, Helferinnen who had served as secretaries, telephone operators, and nurses for the German military. Their uniforms were dirty and torn. Their faces were hollow with hunger and fear. Some had been captured just days ago. Others had been prisoners for weeks, passed from unit to unit as the American advance swept through Germany like a flood. "Where are they taking us?" A young woman with blonde braids asked no one in particular. Her voice was barely a whisper. Her name was Liesel, and she had been a typist at a command post in the Rhineland. She was perhaps 19 years old, too young for the horrors she had witnessed. "Does it matter?" replied another older woman. Her name was Gertrude, and she had been a nurse at a military hospital before its capture. Her uniform, though dirty, still showed the insignia of her medical service. "We are prisoners now. We go where they tell us." The truck lurched forward again, and Helga bit her lip to keep from crying out as the movement sent fresh waves of pain through her injured hand. She had not eaten in 2 days. She had barely slept. The world had become a blur of gray skies and rumbling engines and the constant, grinding fear of what would happen next. She thought of her mother back in Hamburg, if Hamburg still existed. The last letter she had received months ago spoke of terrible bombing raids that had turned the city into an inferno. Tens of thousands dead in a single night, whole neighborhoods reduced to ashes. She did not know if her mother was alive or dead. She did not know if she would ever see her home again. When the truck finally stopped for good, an American soldier lowered the tailgate and shouted something in English. The prisoners did not understand the words, but the meaning was clear enough. They climbed down one by one, their legs stiff from hours of sitting on the hard wooden benches. Helga was the last to move. When she tried to climb down, her legs gave way beneath her. She would have fallen, face first into the mud if a strong hand had not caught her arm. She looked up into the face of an American soldier. He was young, perhaps no older than herself, with red hair and freckles across his nose. He said something she did not understand, his voice surprisingly gentle. Then his eyes fell on her bandaged hand, and his expression changed. "Medic!" he shouted over his shoulder. "We need a medic over here." Helga's heart began to pound. This was it. They had seen her wound. Now they would take her somewhere and cut off her hand with a dirty saw, just as she had been warned. She tried to pull away, but she was too weak. The world swam before her eyes. "No," she whispered in German. "Please, no." But the soldier only held her steady, his grip firm but not cruel, as another figure in olive drab came running toward them across the muddy ground. The building they took her to had once been a German school. The Americans had converted it into a field hospital, and the hallways that once echoed with children's voices now held the sounds of war. Groaning wounded, shouted orders, the clatter of medical equipment being wheeled from room to room. Helga was placed on a stretcher and carried inside by 2 American soldiers. The smell hit her immediately, antiseptic, blood, and something sharp and chemical that she did not recognize. Everywhere she looked, she saw wounded men lying on cots and makeshift beds. Most were American soldiers, but she spotted a few German uniforms as well. They were treating Germans. The realization struck her like a physical blow. The enemy was treating wounded Germans in the same hospital where they treated their own men. A German soldier with a bandaged chest lay in a bed next to an American with his leg in a cast. They were not separated. They were not treated differently. They were simply patients, all of them, receiving care. That cannot be right, she murmured to herself. It must be a trick. A nurse appeared beside her, an American woman with brown hair pulled back in a tight bun. She smiled and said something in English, her voice calm and professional. When Helga did not respond, the nurse simply patted her shoulder reassuringly and began to unwrap the bandage from her hand. What lay beneath was worse than Helga had allowed herself to imagine. Her fingers were swollen to twice their normal size, the skin stretched tight and discolored in shades of purple and black. The smell of infection rose from the wound like a wave. The nurse's smile faltered for just a moment before she recovered and called out something to a colleague across the room. More people gathered around Helga's stretcher. She heard urgent voices, saw concerned faces looking down at her hand. Someone was shaking their head. Someone else was pointing at her fingers and speaking rapidly. A doctor approached, examined the wound, and frowned deeply. They are deciding how to cut it off, Helga thought, and the tears she had been holding back finally began to fall. They are deciding whether to take the whole hand or just the fingers. She closed her eyes and waited for the end to come. But the end did not come. Instead, Helga felt herself being lifted again, stretcher and all, and carried down a hallway to another room. This room was smaller, cleaner, with bright lights overhead and metal tables lined with surgical instruments. The sight of those instruments made her heart nearly stop. "Please," she begged in German, not knowing if anyone could understand her. "Please do not cut off my hand. I need my hand. I am a telegraph operator. My hands are everything. Please." A man appeared at her side. He was tall, perhaps in his 40s, with graying hair at his temples and tired lines around his eyes. He wore a white coat over his military uniform, and his hands were already being fitted with surgical gloves by an assistant. When he looked down at Helga, his expression was serious but not unkind. He spoke to her in English, and though she could not understand the words, something in his tone made her pause. There was no anger in his voice, no cruelty. He sounded almost like her own father had sounded when she was a child and had hurt herself playing in the garden. The nurse who had first unwrapped her bandage appeared beside the doctor. She said something to him, gesturing at Helga's face, at the tears still streaming down her cheeks. The doctor nodded slowly, then turned and spoke to someone Helga could not see. A moment later, another figure approached the table. This one was different from the others. He wore a German uniform. Helga stared at him in confusion. He was young, perhaps 30, with a thin face and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His left arm was in a sling, but otherwise he seemed uninjured. "I am Corporal Werner Hoffmann," he said in German, his voice calm and measured. "I am a prisoner here, like you. I speak English. The Americans have asked me to translate for you." "They are going to cut off my hand," Helga said, her voice breaking. "Tell them I do not want them to. Tell them I would rather die." Werner Hoffmann shook his head slowly. "They are not going to cut off your hand. That is what I came to tell you." He paused, glancing at the American doctor who was examining Helga's wound with a magnifying glass. "This man is Captain James Morrison. He is a surgeon, one of the best, they say. He has looked at your hand, and he believes he can save it." Helga could not process what she was hearing. "Save it? But the infection? The blackness?" "The infection is bad," Werner agreed. "He is not lying to you about that. The surgery will be difficult. It will take many hours. There is a chance it will not work, and he may have to amputate after all. But he wants to try." Werner paused, and something like wonder crept into his voice. "He says he will not give up on your hand unless he has no other choice." Helga looked at the American surgeon, at Captain James Morrison, who was still bent over her hand with intense concentration. He did not look up. He was completely focused on his examination, his brow furrowed, his lips moving slightly as if he were calculating something complicated in his head. "Why?" she asked. "Why would he do this? I am the enemy. I am nothing to him." Werner translated the question. Captain Morrison looked up, meeting Helga's eyes for the first time. He spoke slowly, giving Werner time to translate each sentence. "He says you are not his enemy. You are his patient. He says he took an oath when he became a doctor, an oath to help anyone who needs healing, no matter who they are or where they come from. He says your hand does not know what country it belongs to. It only knows that it is injured and needs to be fixed. Helga stared at the surgeon. In 6 years of war, she had heard many speeches about honor and duty. She had heard generals talk about sacrifice and politicians talk about glory. But she had never heard anyone speak quite like this. "Tell him," she whispered. "Tell him I am grateful. Tell him I do not understand why he would help me, but I am grateful." When Werner translated these words, Captain Morrison simply nodded. Then he began to prepare for surgery. The next 4 hours were the longest of Helga's life. She was given something for the pain, a shot in her arm that made the world go soft and blurry around the edges, but she did not sleep. She could not sleep. She watched through heavy-lidded eyes as Captain Morrison worked on her hand with the patience and precision of a watchmaker. He cut away dead tissue with tiny scissors. He cleaned the infected areas with solutions that turned dark with poison as they were applied. He examined each finger individually, pressing gently, testing for signs of life beneath the damaged skin. Twice his assistant suggested that amputation might be the safer option. Twice he shook his head and continued working. Werner Hoffmann stayed in the room the entire time, translating whenever the doctors needed to tell Helga something. But mostly there was silence, broken only by the soft sounds of surgical instruments and the quiet murmur of medical instructions. At one point, when the surgery was perhaps half complete, Captain Morrison paused to stretch his back and flex his fingers. He was tired. Helga could see it in the lines of his face. She later learned that he had already performed 3 surgeries that day before taking on her case. He had been on his feet for nearly 12 hours. A younger doctor, an assistant, approached him with a cup of coffee. They exchanged a few words, and the assistant gestured toward the door, clearly suggesting that Morrison should take a break. But the surgeon shook his head, took a single sip of coffee, and turned back to Helga's hand. "What did he say?" Helga asked Werner. Werner's translation came with a note of disbelief. "He said he cannot leave now. He said your hand has finally started to respond to the treatment, and if he stops now, all the progress will be lost. He said he will finish what he started." Helga turned her face away, so no. One would see her tears. She did not understand this man. She did not understand any of this. For years she had been told that Americans were monsters, that they cared nothing for German lives, that they would happily watch their enemies suffer and die. And yet here was this surgeon, exhausted and overworked, refusing to give up on the hand of a prisoner he had never met before today. The surgery continued. Captain Morrison worked on each finger as if it were the most important thing in the world. He sutured torn blood vessels. He removed fragments of dirt and debris that had been driven deep into the wounds. He applied medicines and bandages with the care of an artist completing a masterpiece. At one point, he paused to examine her index finger more closely. The infection there was the worst, and Helga could see concern in his eyes. He spoke quietly with his assistant, pointing at something she could not see. For a terrible moment, she thought he was going to give up, to admit defeat and reach for the amputation saw. Instead, he called for additional instruments, additional medicine. He bent closer over her hand, his concentration so intense that he seemed to forget anyone else was in the room. For the next 30 minutes, he worked on that single finger, fighting for it inch by inch, refusing to surrender. And finally, after 4 hours and 17 minutes, he stepped back from the table and nodded to himself. "Tell her," he said to Werner, his voice rough with fatigue, "that I have done everything I can. The infection was severe and her fingers were badly damaged. But I believe if she is careful and follows the recovery instructions, she will keep her hand. All 5 fingers." When Werner translated these words, Helga broke down completely. She sobbed like a child, great heaving cries that shook her entire body. She tried to speak to thank the surgeon, but no words would come. All she could do was cry. Captain Morrison watched her for a moment, then reached out and gently patted her shoulder. He said something soft, something Werner did not translate, but that Helga understood anyway. It was the universal language of comfort, the kind of gesture a father might make to a frightened child. Then he turned and walked out of the operating room, leaving Helga to stare at her bandaged hand through her tears, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Recovery was slow, painful, and filled with small miracles. Helga was moved from the operating room to a recovery ward, a long room filled with beds where wounded soldiers and prisoners alike lay healing from their injuries. She was given her own bed, clean sheets, and a pillow that smelled faintly of soap. These simple comforts felt impossibly luxurious after weeks of sleeping in trucks, train cars, and bombed-out buildings. The American nurses checked on her regularly, changing her bandages and administering medicine. They smiled at her even though she could not understand their words. One nurse, a young woman with bright red curls and a face full of freckles, made a point of learning a few German phrases. "Guten Morgen," she would say each morning, her accent terrible but her smile genuine. "Wie geht es Ihnen heute?" "How are you today?" Helga did not know how to answer that question. Physically, she was in pain. Her hand throbbed constantly, and the medicine made her dizzy and nauseous. But emotionally, she was lost in a confusion so deep that she could not find her way out. Everything she had been taught about the enemy was wrong. That was the truth she was forced to confront every single day. The Americans were not monsters. They were not savages. They were people, ordinary people, who laughed at jokes and complained about the food and wrote letters home to their families just like Germans did. The food in the hospital was better than anything Helga had eaten in years. There was bread, soft and fresh, nothing like the hard, sawdust-filled loaves she had grown accustomed to in Germany. There was meat, real meat, served in portions that seemed almost wasteful. There were vegetables and fruits, and most amazing of all, chocolate. The first time a nurse offered her a small piece of chocolate, Helga stared at it as if it were made of gold. "Go on," the nurse said, miming the act of eating. "It's good. Chocolate." Helga put the chocolate in her mouth and closed her eyes. The taste was so sweet, so rich, that it brought tears to her eyes. She had not tasted chocolate since before the war. She had almost forgotten what it was like. "Why do you give me this?" she asked, even though the nurse could not understand her. "Why do you treat me with such kindness? Do you not know that my country bombed your cities? Do you not know that Germans killed your friends, your brothers, your sons?" But the nurse only smiled and patted her arm before moving on to the next patient. The routine of the hospital became a kind of anchor for Helga. Each day followed the same pattern. Wake with the morning light, receive breakfast on a tray, have her bandages changed, practice moving her fingers as the doctors instructed, eat lunch, rest, eat dinner, sleep. The predictability was comforting after months of chaos and uncertainty. She began to notice small things about her caregivers. The red-haired nurse, whose name was Sarah, had a photograph of a young man in her pocket that she would look at during quiet moments. Her sweetheart, Helga guessed, somewhere far away. Another nurse, an older woman with gray streaks in her brown hair, hummed hymns as she worked, the melodies hauntingly familiar even though the words were different. Captain Morrison visited her every day during her recovery. He would examine her hand carefully, checking for signs of infection, testing the movement of her fingers, noting her progress in a small notebook he carried in his coat pocket. He rarely spoke, but when he did, Werner Hoffmann was usually there to translate. "He says your hand is healing well," Werner told her one morning, about a week after the surgery. "The infection is gone. The blood is flowing properly to all your fingers. He is very pleased." "Tell him thank you," Helga said. "Tell him I say thank you every day, even if he cannot hear me." When Werner translated this, Captain Morrison looked at Helga with something like surprise. Then slowly he smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile since the day of her surgery. "He says," Werner continued, "that you do not need to thank him. He says he was only doing his job, but he also says that you have been a very good patient, and that makes his job easier." Helga laughed, a sound that surprised her. She could not remember the last time she had laughed. "Tell him I am a good patient, because I am afraid of what he will do to me if I am a bad one." Werner hesitated, clearly unsure if he should translate this, but Helga nodded encouragingly, and so he did. Captain Morrison's smile widened into a grin. He said something in English that made Werner laugh as well. "He says that is very wise of you. He says troublesome patients have to eat extra vegetables." It was a small joke, a tiny moment of shared humanity in the middle of a war that had destroyed millions of lives. But to Helga it meant more than she could express. For just a moment she was not a prisoner, and he was not the enemy. They were simply two people, one healing and one helping, connected by the simple act of caring. As the days passed, Helga began to learn more about the world she had stumbled into. Werner Hoffmann, the translator, became something like a friend. He had been a teacher before the war, a professor of English literature at a university in Munich. He had been wounded during the final German offensive and captured by American forces shortly afterward. "I was terrified when they captured me," he told Helga one afternoon as they sat together in the hospital's small courtyard. The spring sun was warm on their faces, and somewhere nearby a bird was singing. "I had heard all the same stories you had. I thought they would torture me for information, or simply shoot me and leave my body in a ditch. Instead, they bandaged my wound, gave me food and water, and asked if I spoke English. When I said yes, they put me to work as a translator." "And they have treated you well?" Helga asked. Werner was quiet. For a moment, looking out at the spring flowers that were beginning to bloom in the courtyard. "Better than well," he said finally. "Better than I ever could have imagined. They treat me like a human being. They ask for my help instead of demanding it. When I do a good job, they thank me." He shook his head slowly. "I keep waiting for the trick, for the cruelty to begin. But it never does." "Perhaps there is no trick," Helga said softly. "Perhaps this is simply who they are." "Perhaps," Werner agreed. "And if that is true, then what does it say about everything we were told? What does it say about the war we fought, the cause we served?" Helga had no answer to that question. She was not sure there was an answer. All she knew was that her hand was healing, that she was being fed and cared for, and that the enemy she had feared for so long was not an enemy at all. She began to write letters home. The Americans allowed it, even encouraged it, providing paper and pencils and promising to send the letters through the Red Cross. She wrote to her mother in Hamburg, to her sister in Berlin, to her grandmother in the small village where she had spent her childhood summers. She did not tell them everything. She could not explain the confusion she felt, the way her world had been turned upside down. But she told them she was alive, that she was being treated well, that they should not worry about her. "The Americans are not what we thought," she wrote in one letter. "I cannot explain it in words. But they are not what we were told. They are not monsters. Some of them are even kind." She wondered if her family would believe her. She wondered if she would have believed it herself just a few weeks ago. 3 weeks after her surgery, Helga's bandages were finally removed for good. Captain Morrison performed the procedure himself, carefully cutting away the layers of gauze and cotton that had protected her healing hand. Helga watched with her heart in her throat, afraid of what she might see. The memory of those blackened, swollen fingers still haunted her nightmares, but what emerged from the bandages was not a ruined claw. It was a hand. Her hand. Scarred, yes, and still weak, but whole. All 5 fingers were there, pink and alive, moving when she told them to move. "Try to make a fist," Werner translated for the surgeon. "Slowly. Do not force it." Helga concentrated, willing her fingers to curl inward. They moved stiffly, reluctantly, but they moved. She made a loose fist, then opened her hand again. The motion was weak and painful, but it was possible. "It will take time," Captain Morrison said through Werner. "You will need to exercise the muscles, build back the strength, but the function is there. You will be able to use your hand again." Helga looked at her hand, then at the surgeon who had saved it. She thought of all the hours he had spent in that operating room, all the skill and patience he had poured into keeping her fingers attached to her body. She thought of the meals she had eaten, the care she had received, the kindness that had been shown to her at every turn, and something inside her finally broke. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no sudden revelation, no flash of light or clap of thunder. It was quieter than that, more subtle. It was simply the final collapse of a wall that had been crumbling for weeks, the last defense of a belief system that could no longer hold. She had been taught that the world was divided into friends and enemies, Germans and others, good people and bad. She had been taught that her nation was special, chosen, destined for greatness, and that anyone who stood against it was evil. She had believed these things because everyone around her believed them, because questioning them was dangerous, because it was easier to accept than to think. But here in this American field hospital, surrounded by people who were supposed to be her enemies, Helga could no longer believe any of it. The evidence was too strong. The kindness was too real. The humanity of these supposed monsters was too obvious to deny. That night she wrote in the small diary she had begun keeping, "I was told the Americans would cut off my hand. Instead, a man I had never met spent 4 hours saving it. I was told they would starve me, beat me, humiliate me. Instead, they fed me chocolate and gave me clean sheets and smiled at me when they changed my bandages. How can this be? How can everything I believed be so completely wrong? I think of my brother, who died on the Eastern Front. I think of my father, who lost his shop when the bombs fell on Hamburg. I think of all the suffering, all the sacrifice, all the death. And I wonder, what was it for? If the enemy is not evil, if they are simply people like us, then what was the point of any of it? I have no answers. I have only questions. But I know one thing for certain. I cannot hate these people. I cannot hate Captain Morrison, who saved my hand. I cannot hate the nurse who taught herself German words to make me smile. I cannot hate the soldiers who carried me from the truck when I was too weak to walk. Perhaps hate was always the wrong answer. Perhaps it was hate that brought us to this place, this ruin, this end of everything we knew. And perhaps the only way forward is to let the hate go, even if it means admitting that everything we believed was a lie." She closed the diary and lay back on her pillow, staring at the ceiling. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the hospital settling down for the night. Footsteps in the hallway, the murmur of voices, the distant rumble of trucks on the road. The war was almost over. Everyone knew it. Germany was collapsing, the Reich crumbling into dust. Soon the fighting would stop, and the world would begin the long process of rebuilding. But for Helga, the real transformation had nothing to do with armies or borders. It was happening inside her, in the quiet hours of the night, in the space between one breath and the next. She was becoming someone new, someone who could see the world without the filter of propaganda, someone who could recognize humanity even in the faces of former enemies. It was painful, this transformation. It was frightening. But it was also, in its own way, a kind of liberation. The walls that had confined her thinking were coming down, and beyond them lay a world that was larger and more complex and more hopeful than anything she had imagined. She flexed her healing hand in the darkness, feeling the pull of new scar tissue, the weakness of muscles slowly rebuilding themselves. "I will use this hand to build something," she promised herself. "I do not know what yet, but whatever I build, it will not be built on hate." She thought of her mother, waiting somewhere in the ruins of Hamburg, not knowing if her daughter was alive or dead. She thought of her sister in Berlin, trying to survive in a city divided by armies. She thought of all the people she had known before the war, the friends and neighbors and colleagues who had been swept up in the same tide of propaganda and nationalism that had carried her along. How many of them, she wondered, had experienced something like this? How many had been shown kindness by the enemy and been forced to question everything they believed? And how many were still clinging to the old hatreds, unable or unwilling to let them go? She knew that when she returned home, she would find people who would not want to hear what she had learned. They would want to hold on to their anger, their sense of victimhood, their certainty that they had been right all along. They would not want to hear that the Americans had been kind, that the enemy had been human, that perhaps the war had not been the noble struggle they had been told. But Helga also knew that she could not unlearn what she had learned. She could not unsee what she had seen. The truth had changed her, and there was no going back to the person she had been before. All she could do was carry that truth with her, share it when she could, and hope that others would be willing to listen. The turning point came on an ordinary Tuesday morning, nearly a month after Helga's surgery. She was practicing the exercises Captain Morrison had prescribed for her hand, slowly opening and closing her fingers, when she heard a commotion in the hallway outside the recovery ward. Voices were raised, not in anger, but in excitement. Footsteps hurried past. Someone was laughing. Werner Hoffman appeared in the doorway, his thin face flushed, his eyes bright behind his glasses. "The war is over," he said. "Germany has surrendered. It is finished." Helga stared at him, unable to process the words. The war was over. The thing that had consumed her entire adult life, that had shaped every decision she had ever made, that had killed her brother and destroyed her city and brought her to this hospital bed, it was over. She did not know what to feel. Relief, certainly. Grief, absolutely. But beyond that, there was something else. Something harder to name. It was like standing at the edge of a cliff and looking out at a vast, unknown landscape. The familiar world had ended. A new one was beginning, and she had no idea what it would look like. The Americans celebrated that night. There was music playing somewhere, a radio tuned to an American station, and the sound of singing and laughter drifted through the hospital corridors. Someone had found bottles of wine, and the nurses moved through the wards with cups of it, offering small portions even to the German prisoners. "To peace," the red-haired nurse said, pressing a cup into Helga's good hand. "To the end of all this madness." Helga drank the wine. It was sweet and slightly warm, and it tasted like the end of the world. Later that night, Captain Morrison came to see her. He was not celebrating. His face was tired, his eyes shadowed with a weariness that went beyond simple exhaustion. He had been a surgeon in a war, Helga realized. He had seen things no one should have to see, done things that would stay with him forever. He sat down in the chair beside her bed, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Werner was not there to translate, but somehow that seemed appropriate. Some conversations did not need words. Finally, Captain Morrison reached out and gently took her healing hand in both of his. He examined it carefully, as he had done so many times before, testing the flexibility of each finger, checking the healing of each scar. Then he looked up at her and nodded. His eyes were bright with something that might have been tears, or might have been simple exhaustion. He said a single word, one that Helga had learned during her weeks in the hospital. "Good." That was all, just one word. But Helga understood everything he meant by it. Her hand was good. The surgery had worked. She would keep her fingers. After everything that had happened, after all the fear and pain and uncertainty, that one small miracle had come true. She thought of the woman on the transport truck, the one who had warned her that the Americans would cut off her hand. She thought of all the propaganda, all the lies, all the hatred that had been poured into her ears for years. And she looked at this tired American surgeon, this man who had spent 4 hours saving the hand of an enemy prisoner, and she felt something shift inside her. "Thank you," she said in her broken English, the words clumsy but sincere. "Thank you for my hand. Thank you for everything." Captain Morrison smiled, the same tired smile she had seen that day in the operating room. He patted her hand gently, then stood up to leave. At the door he paused and turned back. He said something in English, speaking slowly so she might understand. Helga did not catch every word, but she understood enough. He had said something about hands building and hands destroying. He had said something about choosing what kind of hands we want to have. He had said something about hope. Then he was gone, and Helga was left alone with her healing hand and her new understanding of the world. The weeks that followed the surrender were strange and uncertain. The hospital continued to operate, treating the wounded of both sides, but the urgency was gone. There were no more incoming casualties from the front. The war machine had stopped, and in its absence there was only the slow work of healing and waiting. Helga learned to use her hand again. It was slow, frustrating work, filled with setbacks and small victories. Some days she could barely close her fingers around a pencil. Other days she surprised herself by writing entire pages in her diary without pain. Captain Morrison had told her that full recovery might take a year or more, and she was beginning to understand what he meant. But physical recovery was only part of the challenge. The harder work was happening inside her head. Letters began arriving from home. They were censored and delayed, often arriving weeks after they had been sent, but they brought news of a Germany she barely recognized. Her mother wrote from Hamburg, describing a city of ruins where people lived in cellars and basements, scraping for food among the rubble. Her sister wrote from Berlin, where the Soviet occupation had brought new terrors that Helga could only imagine. "We are surviving," her mother wrote, "but barely. There is no food, no work, no hope. The children are so thin. We dream of bread." Helga read these letters in the comfort of her hospital bed, her stomach full of American food, her body warm under American blankets. The guilt was overwhelming. How could she lie here, safe and fed, while her family starved? How could she accept kindness from the people who had bombed her city, killed her brother, destroyed everything she had known? And yet how could she hate them? How could she turn against Captain Morrison, who had saved her hand? How could she despise the nurses who smiled at her, the soldiers who shared their cigarettes, the system that treated prisoners with more dignity than she had ever expected? The contradiction tore at her. She would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of a world that no longer fit together. She had been taught that war was simple. Good versus evil, us versus them, right versus wrong. But here in this hospital, she had learned that nothing was simple. The enemy could be kind. The victim could be guilty. The hero could be tired and human and full of doubt. "I do not know who I am anymore," she wrote in her diary. "I was German. I was loyal. I believed what I was told. And now all of that is gone, and I am left with nothing but questions. Who am I, if not what my country made me? What do I believe if everything I was taught was a lie?" Werner Hoffmann found her crying one afternoon, sitting alone in the courtyard with her diary open on her lap. He sat down beside her without speaking and waited until she was ready to talk. "How do you do it?" she asked him finally. "How do you accept all of this? How do you not go mad?" Werner was quiet for a long moment, watching a bird hop along the top of the courtyard wall. "I think," he said slowly, "that we have a choice. We can spend the rest of our lives being angry, hating the Americans for winning, hating ourselves for losing, hating the world for being different than we thought. Or we can accept that we were wrong, that we were lied to, that we believed things that were not true, and we can try to build something better." "But how?" Helga demanded. "How do you build anything when everything has been destroyed?" "One piece at a time," Werner said. "One day at a time. One act of kindness at a time." He looked at her healing hand. "Someone built that, you know. Someone spent 4 hours putting it back together when they could have simply cut it off. That is building. That is choosing creation over destruction. And if one American surgeon can do that for one German prisoner, then perhaps there is hope for all of us." Helga looked down at her hand, at the scars that would never fully fade, at the fingers that were slowly, painfully learning to work again. "Perhaps you are right," she said softly. "Perhaps that is the only way forward." The day finally came when Helga was discharged from the hospital. Her hand had healed enough that she no longer needed constant medical care. She was being transferred to a prisoner of war camp to await repatriation to Germany. She packed her few possessions, the diary, the letters from home, the small bar of chocolate she had been saving, into a bundle of cloth. The red-haired nurse came to say goodbye, pressing a photograph into Helga's good hand. "So you remember us?" she said, her eyes bright with tears. Helga looked at the photograph. It showed the nursing staff of the hospital, gathered together in front of the building, smiling at the camera. The red-haired nurse was in the front row. Captain Morrison stood to one side, his white coat slightly rumpled, his tired eyes crinkled with what might have been a smile. "I will never forget," Helga said in her broken English. "Never." She did not see Captain Morrison before she left. He was in surgery, someone told her, working to save another life. She understood. That was who he was. That was what he did. He did not need goodbyes or gratitude. He just needed to keep building, one patient at a time. As the truck pulled away from the hospital, Helga looked back at the building that had been her home for the past 2 months. She thought of everything that had happened there, everything she had learned, everything she had become. She flexed her healing hand, feeling the pull of the scars, the weakness of the muscles, the miracle of fingers that still worked. "Thank you," she whispered, though no one could hear her. "Thank you for teaching me that enemies are not always what they seem. Thank you for showing me that kindness is stronger than hate. Thank you for saving my hand, and for saving something even more important." She did not know what the future held. She did not know what she would find when she returned to Germany, what was left of her family, her city, her life. But she knew one thing for certain. She would use her hand to build. She would use it to create, to help, to heal. She would pass on the kindness that had been shown to her, one act at a time, one day at a time. That was the only way forward. That was the only answer that made sense. Helga Weiss lived to be 87 years old. She outlived almost everyone who had been in that hospital in the spring of 1945. The nurses, the soldiers, the other prisoners. But she never stopped telling the story of what happened there. She returned to Germany in the autumn of 1945, to a country she barely recognized. Hamburg was rubble. Her childhood home was gone. Her mother had aged 20 years in the space of 5. The streets where she had played as a girl were now nothing but broken stone and twisted metal. The church where she had been baptized was a burned shell. The school where she had learned to read was a pile of bricks. But they survived, as so many did, rebuilding their lives one brick at a time. Helga found work as a translator at first, using the English skills she had begun to develop in the hospital. She helped American occupation officials communicate with German civilians, serving as a bridge between two peoples who had so recently been at war. Later, she became a teacher. She taught English to German schoolchildren, helping them learn the language of the people who had once been their enemies. She believed that language was a bridge, that understanding began with communication, that every word learned was a step toward peace. Her students loved her, though they did not know the story behind the scars on her right hand. She married a man named Friedrich in 1948, a former soldier who had also been a prisoner of war. He had been captured by the British and spent 2 years in a camp in England. Like Helga, he had been treated with unexpected kindness by his captors. Like Helga, he had emerged from the experience with his beliefs transformed. They understood each other in a way that others could not, and their marriage lasted 53 years, until Friedrich's death in 2001. Together, they had 3 children, 2 daughters, and a son. Helga told them all the story of Captain Morrison and the 4-hour surgery that saved her hand. She wanted them to understand that the world was more complicated than propaganda suggested, that enemies could become friends, that kindness could appear in the most unexpected places. Her children grew up believing in the possibility of reconciliation, and they passed that belief on to their own children. She never forgot Captain James Morrison. In 1967, more than 20 years after the war, Helga traveled to America for the first time as a free woman. She had spent years trying to find the surgeon who saved her hand, writing letters, making inquiries, following leads that went nowhere. But finally, with the help of veterans organizations on both sides of the Atlantic, she found him. He was retired by then, living in a small town in Ohio with his wife and grandchildren. His hair had gone completely white, and he walked with a cane, but his eyes were the same. Tired, kind, filled with the weight of everything he had seen. When Helga knocked on his door, he did not recognize her at first. How? Could he? He had operated on hundreds of patients during the war, saved hundreds of hands and feet and lives. She was just one face among many, one story among thousands. But when she held up her hand, the one he had spent 4 hours saving, he remembered. His eyes widened, and for a moment he seemed to travel back through time, back to that operating room in a converted German schoolhouse, back to the young woman with the infected hand and the tear-stained face. "The German girl," he said softly. "The telegraph operator. I remember. Your hand was so badly infected I thought for sure we would have to amputate. But there was something in your eyes, something that made me want to try harder than I had ever tried before." Helga's heart nearly stopped. He remembered. After all these years, after all the patients he had treated, he remembered her. They sat together on his porch that afternoon, 2 old enemies who had become something else entirely. Helga showed him photographs of her children, her grandchildren, the life she had built with the hand he had saved. She told him about her work as a teacher, about the thousands of students she had taught over the years, about the bridges she had tried to build between nations. "None of it would have been possible without you," she told him, her English fluent now after decades of practice. "You saved more than my hand that day. You saved my future. You saved my children. You saved everything that came after." Captain Morrison, Dr. Morrison now, was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I was just doing my job," he said. "I took an oath to heal, and that is what I tried to do. But I am glad—" He paused, looking at her hand, at the scars that had faded with time, but never completely disappeared. "I am glad it worked. I am glad you used it well." Helga reached out and took his hand in hers, the healed and the healer, the former enemy and the former enemy, 2 human beings connected by an act of mercy performed in the chaos of war. "You taught me something that day," she said. "You taught me that kindness is stronger than hate. You taught me that building is better than destroying. You taught me that enemies are just people we have not yet learned to understand." She smiled, tears streaming down her face. "I have spent my whole life trying to pass that lesson on. I have tried to teach it to my students, my children, everyone I meet. And it all started with you, in that operating room, when you chose to save my hand instead of cutting it off." Dr. Morrison squeezed her hand gently, his old eyes bright with tears of his own. "That is all any of us can do," he said. "Try to build more than we destroy. Try to heal more than we wound. Try to leave the world a little better than we found it." They sat together in silence as the sun set over Ohio, 2 people from opposite sides of a terrible war, united by an act of unexpected humanity. And that is the story of Helga Weiss and James Morrison. It is a story about war and wounds, about fear and kindness, about the power of mercy to transform even the deepest hatred. It is a story that reminds us that the enemy is not always what we think, and that sometimes the greatest weapon is not a gun or a bomb, but a steady hand and a willing heart. Helga passed away in 2009, surrounded by her family, her hand still bearing the scars of that long-ago injury. In her final years, she often spoke of Captain Morrison, of the hospital in Germany, of the 4 hours that changed everything. "They told me the Americans would cut off my hand," she would say, smiling at the memory. "Instead, they saved it, and in saving my hand, they saved my soul." Her daughter Maria kept the photograph of the hospital staff that the red-haired nurse had given Helga all those years ago. She kept the diary, too, those pages filled with confusion and fear and slowly dawning understanding. These artifacts of her mother's transformation became precious family heirlooms, reminders that even in the worst of times, humanity could prevail. The story of Helga and Captain Morrison spread beyond the family. Journalists wrote about it. Historians included it in their accounts of the war. Schools used it as a lesson about compassion and the complex nature of conflict. What had been a private moment between a surgeon and a patient became something larger, a symbol of hope in a world that often seemed hopeless. So the next time you hear about enemies and hatred, about us and them, about the terrible things people do to each other in war, remember this story. Remember that even in the darkest times, humanity can shine through. Remember that kindness can appear in the most unexpected places. Remember that it is always possible to choose building over destroying, healing over wounding, love over hate. And remember that sometimes a single act of mercy can echo through generations, changing lives that the original actor will never even know about. Captain Morrison never knew how far the ripples of his kindness would spread. He never knew about the thousands of students Helga would teach, the 3 children she would raise, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren who would inherit her belief in the power of compassion. He was just a tired surgeon in a field hospital, doing his job, honoring the oath he had taken years before. He did not think of himself as a hero. He did not expect gratitude or recognition. He simply saw a wounded hand that needed healing and refused to give up on it. But that single decision, made in the exhaustion of war, changed the course of a life. And that life changed other lives, and those lives changed others still, spreading outward like ripples in a pond until the original stone is long forgotten. That is the true power of kindness. That is the legacy of Helga and James. And that is a story worth remembering. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe to our channel. We bring you true accounts from history that deserve to be told. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and remember, kindness is always stronger than hate. Thank you for watching. Until next time,